In this video, I want to discuss just 5 seconds of Bishop Robert Barron. Their words he spoke in response to an initial statement of Dr. Jordan Peterson in a discussion which they recently had. There are significant concepts in these few seconds of Bishop Barron. There's also a note of exasperation, I think, in my impression, in his demeanour, which I think is also significant. Watch this.
I'm just wondering, well, what you might be thinking about in relationship to that possibility.
Yeah, there's so much there. There's questions of hermeneutics and questions of metaphysics and questions of psychology and that.
So Bishop Barron has highlighted that there's 3 threads within what Jordan Peterson has just spoken, and we'll have a look at that later. That is to say, hermeneutics, metaphysics, and psychology. And Bishop Barron's manner, and indeed his words, and indeed the next 15 minutes of this discussion, seem to suggest that Jordan Peterson has sort of slightly randomly, slightly eccentrically thrown these 3 threads together, packed too much in to one answer. And for me, this is quite a significant misunderstanding, because Jordan Peterson's actual philosophy does see these things interwoven. Metaphysics and hermeneutics or semantics, or the meaning of things, are deeply overlapping in his philosophy. And this is not recognized by Bishop Barron. Similarly, Jordan Peterson doesn't seem to see that this is the misunderstanding that's happening. And indeed, nor does he investigate Bishop Barron's rather different philosophical presumptions. And as a result, the first 20 minutes or so of this video and this discussion are a little bit confusing, and there's a missed opportunity for understanding each other, synthesizing some of their insights, correcting and purifying their respective visions. So I want to do 2 things now in this video. One is to go through the philosophical visions of each of them, with particular emphasis upon respective presuppositions which do disagree with each other and are purely implicit in this discussion and 1 or 2 others that Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson have had. And then secondarily, to illustrate this with a few quick clips from their actual discussion. So for this first part, I'm going to use a table just to give a brief overview of some of these differences and a picture of the respective visions. We have Jordan Peterson and Bishop Barron here. I just want to say something about their ontology, which is a word used for the sort of basic patterns within our cosmos, normally, of the way things exist. So it's a subset, really, of metaphysics, which looks at the most general concepts of being in play in someone's system. And secondarily, just to look at the theory of truth that they each have. And third, just to look at some key aspects in their actual discussion from 4 weeks ago with some clips. One thing I think they both do agree on, and maybe one of the reasons they have sort of respect for each other and it's useful to hear them discuss, is that they both have a concept of an absolute goodness. Obviously for Barron, it's going to be God. It's not quite that for Jordan Peterson, although he's open to discussing that. Sometimes I think perhaps more as a sort of archetype. So, and when we come to the theory of truth, we're going to see, I think they both are tending towards realism. They believe there's an objective reality, as it were, out there in some sense, distinct from the observer. As we're going to see for Bishop Barron, it's clearly independent in its intelligibility and how we describe its ontology, which is not the case for Jordan Peterson. So we come to some of their big distinctions, and I would use these terms here. Jordan Peterson is basically an existentialist, Bishop Barron, his ontology is basically an essentialist. That's a big difference, which they don't seem to be acknowledging in their discussion. When it comes to theory of truth, Jordan Peterson is basically into pragmatism, and Bishop Barron's within the traditional, scholastic tradition of some form of classic correspondence theory of truth. So we shall see that pragmatism sort of roots what is truth in what works. A truth is a capacity to act, ultimately. That's what knowledge is. for correspondence, there's some sort of conforming of the mind with what is out there. And just to shoot through, get into a little bit of detail here, feel free to fast forward if you want. But in terms of Kant's turn to the subject, Immanuel Kant in the late 18th and early 19th century highlighted the relevance of the subject to what exists. And this is crucial for Jordan Peterson, but it's only really of methodological relevance to Barron. And we're going to see that particularly in the videos coming up. The existentialist tends to sort of say the basic ontology, the basic patterns of things in our world are related and rooted in the subject-object unity, whereas the essentialist and the scholastic Catholic tradition tends to say that what is, the fundamental patterns that are to do with the objects, the physical objects that we, through our sensation, get access to, and they are the key organisms, and the key things are forms which form matter. That is to say, using Aristotelian hylomorphism. Hylo meant matter, morphe meant form, form and matter. It's a very classic ontology there. And so when we come to symbols, which of course, Jordan Peterson and collaborators of his, like Jonathan Pageau, very interesting in the discussing symbols. This is foundational to ontology for Jordan Peterson, but it's only secondary in an essentialist type of thought. So when we come to what the essence of things are, it's dynamic, interrelative affordances. That's a technical phrase from James Gibson, who's also a psychologist and a philosopher, based on his psychology, as Jordan Peterson is. And affordances are basically what the objects around us enable us to do. And that enabling of human action is fundamental to ontology, and it's a dynamic interrelative thing with the subject for Jordan Peterson. Whereas the essence of things in scholasticism is a definitive unity of the object made of form and matter, and we can define the essences of created things very much like modern dictionary definitions. And so they have a different view of what the essences is. Classic example, which comes from James Gibson, used by Pageau and Peterson particularly, is that the essence of a cliff is primarily, and its meaning and its existentiality, and what it is therefore in itself is a falling off place, and secondarily a sheer rock face, which is what it is in the more Greco-scholastic thought. When we come to the theory of truth, we have pragmatism, and let's look at it in terms of these four categories here. As I've already touched on, truth is a capacity to act which is successful, and that is what confirms the truth. So it's a knowledge is interpreted primarily as an awareness of what I can do in my environment, and it's confirmed by success. Whereas for the correspondence theory of truth, there's somehow a form is abstracted into the mind. It's put in what the scholastics used to call the passive intellect, and this enables the mind to somehow conform itself to what is out there. So the form in the mind was the same as the form in the thing out there, in the cat. I know a cat. I have a form of cat in my mind, and there's the same form instantiated in the individual cat that I know. That's their theory of truth there. They're both, as I've mentioned, sort of realists. They believe there's something at least distinct from us. If for Barron it's more in the scholasticism, there's a sort of independent intelligibility of something, independent from the subject. Whereas within Peterson's thought, there's a sort of relative impact upon the subject is what we get. So when we have a category, and this is going to be quite important in the discussion, we're going to see that categories of things for the scholastic realist capture a formality and a pattern that is really out there, as it were, that the nouns of our language sort of map on to what's out there, whereas categories in Peterson's mind, as I understand it, are to do with the impact upon the subject. They are sort of layers of possible action, of meaning for the subject, which are what we categorize relative to the object, which is something distinct from us because he's a realist. But they involve the subject, and that's quite a significant thing in the sort of discussions that Barron and Peterson are having. This brings us to a distinction between these two thinkers that is well illustrated by a discussion between an assistant of Bishop Barron, Dr. Petracek, and Jordan Peterson. I'll put the link to that discussion below this video. And in that video, you can see again a serious inability to understand each other. In the scholastic, and indeed the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, an artifact or a fiction or a myth is purely a posit and a projection by the human thinker of something that has exactly the same essence as its equivalent in reality, but doesn't have the act of existence. Whereas something actually out there is radical different between natural things and artifacts, for instance. And Thomas Aquinas, using some, probably it seems, some thought from Muslim thinkers who realized that Aristotle hadn't quite dealt with the distinction between nature and myth, offered this idea of the act of existence, or in Latin, the actus essendi, which is what a natural horse has the act of existence, whereas a horse in a novel, which has the same essence, the same form, the same definition, does not have the act of existence. Whereas we said already, essences in the existentialist and pragmatic tradition are, within a sort of realist version of existentialism and pragmatism, are relative to the subject. And therefore, the difference between something where there's an emphasis upon the creativity of the human person and not is really a matter of degree. And Peterson's spoken to a lot of people in our modern culture by highlighting that in some ways myths are more real than purely natural objects, for instance, scientific theories. It's not that he's denying their reality and usefulness, but that myths which capture, for instance, moral values are more real, but they're all of the same type of thing, really. In this realistic pragmatism, scientific theories are slight abstractions, almost prescinding from the full essentiality and existentiality of something, when we just talk about as science does, the relations between objects without reference to the subjects. That's a slight abstraction, a secondary thing. Each type of thought has its own challenges. For instance, Peterson's vision takes the activity of the subject so seriously and gives it such a strong role that one can ask, does the objective reality have any sort of power to disprove that and to create falsehood? And similarly, fact and fiction are so close in Peterson. One wonders whether ultimately he's becoming an idealist and just sort of saying, well, humans create everything ultimately. Not sure Peterson's got that fully worked out. And for Bishop Barron's position, we have the classic post-Kantian question: if the intelligibility of objects are intrinsic to what they are, and our knowledge is true and our knowing is intrinsic to what we are, then how can the object be truly independent of the knower? How can that relationship of knowing be irrelevant to what the object is when the knowing is true? Indeed, as in the Judeo-Christian tradition, do we want to say that the knowing of God, which roots everything, is similarly irrelevant to what something is in its essentiality? So there's questions there to be answered by Bishop Barron's position. So I'll now do a quick overview of the key points in the discussions which flow from these implicit presumptions, and then after that shoot through some clips actually illustrating these points. Peterson
starts very excitingly, hoping, I think, that Bishop Barron's going to respond to this and really like it, but actually, because they're on different pages, Bishop Barron never responds to the particular point of similarity. What is similarity? It's been a classic question within Western philosophy, and one that arguably this Catholic scholastic tradition never really answered. They just sort of said, well, there's a sort of participation in the same form. So two different cats, Whiskers and Tabby are the same cat because they share the same form. And then they didn't want to be Platonic. They didn't want to say there's a form of catness in heaven. So they just somehow talked about participation in the same form. It wasn't always very clear what that was. That I've just sort of put in there because it's implicit, I think, in Barron's stuff. But he doesn't actually engage with Peterson's point at all, with which he begins the whole discussion enthusiastically by saying it's a proximity in the space of meaning. Now, when Peterson talks about space of meaning, it's all this stuff above, affordances and things like this, that is fundamentally what he's talking about. And when Peterson's talking about meaning and language, he's talking about, and semantics, he's talking about what for him ultimately, they wouldn't use the word, is what the scholastics would have called metaphysics.
We will see that Barron says that semantics is not metaphysics, it's rooted in metaphysics, so that he doesn't feel the need to discuss similarity. He's going to talk about metaphysics.
Which is a pity, perhaps, because Peterson's engaging with a very important issue and offering a possible solution to this fundamental question. What does it mean to say two different things are the same? But they rapidly after that, in Peterson's initial speech and in Barron's initial response, they deal with what I've called point one and then point two. There, they deal in the second half of their respective little speeches with God, who they both are prepared to refer to God as grounding the principle of reality. Obviously, particularly Bishop Barron, but even Peterson. And for Peterson, he talks about this large language model, which is in the news at the moment because it seems to be one of the key ways in which artificial intelligence is rooted so successfully in very recent times. And Peterson tries to explain what this is, that really there's a sort of mapping of the way human beings use concepts. Looking at the patterns through statistical frequency even of concepts and creating a sort of map of concepts. Of course, relates to Peterson's early book, Maps of Meaning. And he sort of says, well, what we're finding, and one of his students has shown that a central object of a map, when we're talking about things like good and when we're talking about things like being and the verb to be in a large language model, is a concept that he would think is very close even to the scholastic concept of what God is as the absolute being. And Bishop Barron comes back and says, well, it's not categorical. Of course, he's using an essentialist version of what categorical means. It's a sort of formality that's out there in the world. And clearly, if God's the absolute being, you know, there's nothing higher than him, so you can't put him in a higher category because he is the absolute. And he talks about analogical reference, but he's referring, even though he doesn't really get into that, but to Thomas Aquinas' special version of analogy, that Thomas says, well, we use analogy for many things, but sort of comparing two pairs of things through often an implicit common factor. And he sort of says, well, when we do that to God, it's not a comparison with a third common factor, because God is the one we compare to. So, Thomas sort of created this special use of analogy, but it was based upon his sort of essentialist ontology. And it meant that God could not be a being in the world. It's also related to this distinction of essence and existence, which is referred to here. The distinction between fact and fiction was very big in this type of essentialism, which is not for Jordan Peterson. So they both talk about space, and Jordan Peterson very clearly says God is in the meaning space, and Bishop Barron very clearly says God is not in the world space. But they don't really make any effort to connect those concepts and just to acknowledge they're on different planets in some ways. But I think to the casual observer, surely, particularly when they're using this word space, that, you know, do these spaces overlap or do they not? I mean, you know, there's a sort of hint of everything that's above in my table here, but left implicit. You sort of wonder, do they even realize it? I don't know. I mean, tell me. And finally, they get on to human freedom, and I've put this number 5 here because Bishop Barron goes first on this one, and he sort of applies all this stuff above really to say that one of the reasons people don't believe in God is that if you make God a being in the world, he somehow restricts the view of freedom, and he uses Sartre's definition of freedom as a sort of almost as an absolute power here, and it just sort of says, well, you know, God is going to sort of restrict that, and that's why teenage today and young people feel my freedom's being restricted. And Peterson replies with a very different version of freedom and a different version, interpretation indeed, of the burning bush story in the Bible of Moses, in which he highlights that you know, freedom is a response to a call from the good, and a calling to be good. Again, a very different analysis there of what freedom is, without really understanding that they have very different assumptions. So we'll just have a quick look, if you're still with me, at a few of these clips just illustrating this. Peterson begins the whole discussion by saying there's been some very important technical developments, he says, which have bearings on the religious question. He's going to be talking about the objectivity of the concept of God, which Bishop Barron would obviously be interested in. And then Peterson dives straight into a discussion on this concept of similarity. I think he's assuming that Barron and others would recognize that that's always been an important concept in philosophy from the ancient Greeks, because if two things are similar, then they have a certain unity. And we've seen how the concept of unity is important to ontology in both the traditions we've been looking at, and indeed the concept of form came out in ancient Greece, with Plato and Aristotle particularly, as their way of dealing with unity. So we're going to see now in this little clip, right at the beginning, a very short clip, but Peterson has just sort of dived into this, and he's going to quickly, in quick succession, give 3 very brief phrases about what similarity is in this new research that he's involved in. Again, we need to remember that Jordan Peterson's the left-hand column here when he talks about the use of words. For him, that is revealing the dynamic of existence.
We know that some words are more similar than others. And then you might say, well, what makes words or concepts similar? And the answer would be something like substitutability, or you could think about it as, so substitutability with regard to a purpose. It's a very critical and strange definition of similarity, but also proximity in the space of meaning. And then you might say, well, what does it mean for things to be proximal in the meaning space? And it means likely to co-occur.
So some pretty heavy stuff there from Jordan Peterson, just in a very short space of time. And he dives straight into the world of words. And again, we need to remember his philosophical background for an existentialist, particularly as realist existentialist. Words and world are deeply intertwined with each other. So that was here. Question of fact and fiction, that narrative is so important for Jordan Peterson. And here in this very short time, he's given sort of 3 points about similarity, which is an important metaphysical concept, as I've already highlighted. And he starts by saying, well, you know, similarity of terms
is their substitutability with regard to purpose. There's that sense of dynamism of existence and of words already there. And then he sort of says, well, I want to take this deeper with the help of a student of mine. And he uses this phrase that I put in here, proximity in the space of meaning. Meaning is this dynamic between subject and object, which for the existentialist mindset is right at the heart of what reality means. And given his pragmatic leaning as well, proximity in the space of meaning is something to do with an interweaving of capacities to act and of constructive moral action for Peterson. And he finishes with this concept likely to co-occur within the large language model there. I'm now going to just look at it a little bit more from Peterson. This idea of statistical mapping of the co-occurrence of particular concepts has proved to be a very powerful weapon.
Is that it actually learns those associations at multiple levels of comparison simultaneously. So it actually maps out what you might describe as the semantic space or the space of meaning.
And now we can look at Bishop Barron's responses, where he begins to capture that stuff about semantics in his vision is not metaphysics. It's rooted in metaphysics. So he's not an existentialist. Let us look at him introducing this theme.
Yeah, there's so much there. There's questions of hermeneutics and questions of metaphysics and questions of psychology and that. You know, I'm against the postmoderns who want to unravel the self. First of all, there's no really coherent self that does this judging and analyzing. There's also, they want to unravel metaphysics. And what you're arguing there in a more sort of semantic way is that there is a coherence to the self. There is a coherence to the metaphysical structure of the real.
Then Bishop Barron goes on there to, which we'll look at in a few moments' time, to apply this to God as being at the heart of his metaphysics. But now he just a little bit later just reinforces this point about metaphysics being upstream from semantics.
I mean, why is it that people over now millennia have read these texts and found very deep and consistent ideas? It's because they have a semantic structure, which is dependent upon a metaphysical structure, which gives rise to a spiritual transformation. They're classic texts for that reason. And we shouldn't simply read them as, oh, they're just this, you know, coming together of words and I can read it any old way I want to. Well, no, the whole of human interpretive history tells against that. So I think we do have to battle the postmodern, ultimately nihilism metaphysically, and the sort of indifferentism at the level of interpretation.
We'll just have a quick look at where we got to here now. That Bishop Barron has emphasized that his whole vision is to put metaphysics
upstream of
semantics, whereas this is not Jordan Peterson's approach, although they're both being very respectful and not directly contradicting each other. And they're even using the odd concept from the other's vision as if maybe possibly they're on the same page. Well, they are on the same page in terms of absolute good, in terms of realism. But I suppose what I'm arguing in this discussion, they're not much on the same page. So we're now going to move to this stage. Now we're going to look at a clip or two of Jordan Peterson on God, and then Bishop Barron on God. Again, they're sort of trying to sort of emphasize overlap, but to my mind, they are actually bringing out significant, maybe implicit, largely implicit distinctions between the two of them. So here is Jordan Peterson. They even talk about the summum bonum here, which in a Thomistic phrase for God as the highest good. And he's bringing out now that this is needed to make sense of any idea, any concept, any word to do with goodness. He's saying this is a significant thing certainly within an existentialist mindset. This is a very significant thing to say that you need a supreme good to make any sense of moral discourse.
This is where it gets so cool. So imagine if we took a cloud of concepts that people universally recognized as good. So you could imagine that you and me and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins would have a fair amount of agreement on what those goods were. You know, the dignity of the individual, the idea of the good, the idea of the true, the idea of the beautiful, the idea of upward striving. Okay, now imagine that makes a conceptual cloud.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a center of that cloud that constitutes the reason for the similarity of the ideas. And it looks to me like, semantically speaking, so in terms of our verbal content, this might also be true with regards to the stories we tell, that the central concept around which all goods rotate is indistinguishable from the semantic representation of God. And it also looks like we can now map that. So I think we can dispense entirely with the criticism that the interpretation of, say, biblical narratives has to be something arbitrary. And we can also make the case, which Carl Jung made to begin with, is that in any system of value that's coherent, there's going to be a central factor that accounts for its coherence. And it's certainly the case, it's highly probable that that's indistinguishable from the concept of God. That's how it looks. And so that's so cool, because we're starting to be able to use this technology to dispense with opinion. So, you know, Jung said, God, called or uncalled, God is present.
Right, God is there.
Now, right. And I don't remember who he derived that from, but that was what he had carved on his castle at Bollingen. But that's the same idea, right? That implicit in a semantic landscape is the central concept of the highest ideal. That's kind of like the summum bonum. So I'm just wondering, well, what you might be thinking about in relationship to that possibility.
Yeah, there's so much there. There's questions of hermeneutics and questions of metaphysics.
Okay, so in that part of Jordan Peterson, he has made a qualification that he's talking sort of semantically, but as Bishop Barron's just pointed out in a little bit we've seen earlier, he's also talking metaphysics, and that's pretty clear. And in this next clip of Jordan Peterson, he in a sense makes it even clearer. He has made a sort of qualification that he's talking semantically, again with respect, I think, to Bishop Barron. But as we'll see here, he's now going to say, you know, any discourse about objectivity or organization needs God. He seems to be saying, in the true existentialist fashion, that actually this is just to do with objectivity or organization at all. Therefore, that we need this concept of God, and let's make it clear that, again here, that God is within the system of meaning, at the heart of it, certainly, but within, which is going to be in big distinction from what we're going to see Bishop Barron is about to say.
I actually think that battle is over, because I think the large language models are going to demolish their pretensions. So imagine this. Here's a way of two things. So why did God die, let's say, and the psychoanalysts believed that God sunk into the unconscious. That was Jung's proposition, that if God dies formally, all that happens is that the prime factor becomes unconscious. So imagine this is how you could think of that technically. So imagine now you have your cloud of concepts. So with the central factor of the good itself, and maybe the essence of being itself, being by definition, this is by definition, by the way, that's what God is. And when there's a concordance between the explicit religious belief and that implicit network of meaning, you have a conscious God at the center, like you're conscious of that God. But then if you dispense with that central uniting proposition, you don't eradicate the commonalities between what is good. You just let them sink back into implicitness. And that seems to me to be equivalent to the descent of God into the unconscious. That's the same thing as Geppetto, for example, going down into the belly of the whale, is that now God becomes implicit, right? But that doesn't mean that he's not there. He's still coded in the relationship between those things that are meaningful.
Notice there that God needs to be, for Jordan Peterson, explicitly acknowledged, not sort of sunk down into the unconscious, which is a sort of repression, because God is an object of meaningful reference. Lots of other things are objects of meaningful reference. He's the key one, but he's not outside of that network. And now look at the different view of Bishop Barron, which results from his essentialism and his, I think, his correspondence theory of truth.
We would say that God is not a being, but being itself. So the famous answer given to Moses, right? Ego sum qui sum, I am who I am. Moses is asking, what kind of being are you? He's trying to put God in categorical terms. And the answer there is so important, because that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding religious language. Is if we follow Moses and his question, we will inevitably end up in atheism. Because if you think God is a categorical object in the world, eventually you'll say, well, I don't see this object, and there's no evidence for it, and I can explain the world without it. So that's why the answer of God in Exodus is so powerful, because he's saying, dumb question, wrong question. I'm not a thing in the world that you can name. I am who I am, which means I'm the prius, that's Augustine's language. I'm prior to thought and to language. I'm prior to being. I'm that upon which the categorical realm depends.
Right,
so
right.
From that, if you get God is as Aquinas says, the act of to be itself. So Aquinas says God is not en summum, highest being, but ipsum esse, right?
Right,
To
the
be
principle
itself.
of being.
Right. So if you say that, well, then right away you've got the central organizing principle of all reality, and then everything else has to cluster around, which is why we speak about God as being the creator of all things. But also,
so we have there a point Bishop Barron has often made, that is indeed within the Thomistic tradition, that God is not a being, because if you do that, you're from the Thomistic mindset, you're sort of placing him in a context, in an existential context, so he can't be the ultimate being. Of course, from Peterson's point of view, well, surely that context is just the creature in his relationship with the absolute being. So he's not actually, doesn't necessarily have to say that God is therefore not absolute, as Bishop Barron thinks he is. He throws in that sort of concept that if you do that with God and make him just a being within the category of being, then you're somehow putting him in the world and you can't see him. It seems almost there to be sort of saying that if you make God a being, he's within the physical world. But Catholics particularly surely believe in invisible things that we can know and that are beings. So that I think there's a slight confusion there. I don't think he's talking about the physical world. He's talking about the sort of conceptual world. So it's not so much seeing, but understanding. And by saying that, he's sort of doubling back from a sort of clear proof of God from created beings to the creator being, it would seem. We know Aquinas tries to say that through his concept of analogy that I've already spoken about. But either way, we still have this significant distinction here between the God of Jordan Peterson, the summum bonum, perhaps an archetype, certainly at the heart, but within the conceptual framework in a similar way to the way created things are, but not for Bishop Barron. And indeed, we've had these concepts of meaning space and world space that I highlighted earlier, that God is within the meaning space for Jordan Peterson. He's quite excited by that. And Bishop Barron counters by saying, well, he's not in the world space of being. So a disagreement there, but not, to my mind, explicitly acknowledged, because they are not really connecting with the deeper visions that they each have. And now, just to draw towards an end, we see that Bishop Barron is going to apply this to the concept of freedom. And as you'll see, he's going to use the Sartrean concept.
And what
Yep.
happened to God, the disappearance of God, is a function of this misinterpretation of God as a being. And we
Yeah.
can see when that happened. It happened by the late Middle Ages, when Aquinas' more analogical metaphysic gave way to a univocal conception of being. That's in people like William of Ockham. And when that happens, see, God is still there, but God is now one being among many. God's the supreme instance of the category being. Well, all right, in the late Middle Ages, God's still there. We take him seriously. But now move forward. As God is seen as a being among many, he becomes more and more distantiated, more and more irrelevant to the world. And then in early modernity, he becomes a rival to the world. And it has to be that way. If you and I were sort of plotted on the same mathematical grid, we're going to be to some degree over and against each other. We'll be battling for the same space. So God and humanity are on the same grid, both beings, one's smaller, one's bigger, but they're of course going to come into conflict. Now look, read a lot of the early moderns that way. Then keep going, and you come right up to the atheists who finally say, look, I've had it with this being. I don't want this big being interfering with my freedom and my self-definition. Now you've got Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Is if God exists, I can't be free. But I am free, therefore God doesn't exist. That, I would argue, is in the mind of almost every teenager in the West today, that idea.
Right, there's a lot there from Bishop Barron. As on the one hand, he decries naturally the loss of the sense of God. He sort of blames that on making God a being within our conceptual system. There's a sort of battle for space. On the other hand, he's going to bring in a key concept from the culture which has sort of pushed God out the turn to the subject. That is Sartre's view of freedom, to have a context to human freedom within our conceptual and categorical system would be to restrict that. We can see now Peterson, as I've already highlighted, is coming at this from a very different point of view. And here he is introducing a different version of the burning bush that Barron has briefly mentioned as something which supports his view and his Jordan Peterson.
Okay, in any case, what seems to happen in the burning bush story, so imagine this, is that Moses is attracted by something calls to him. Okay, and so that's like a beckoning or a promise. Now, the way that works neurophysiologically is that we're always looking for things that beckon and call as indicators of the path to treasure. Even bees do this, by the way. Like, this is very, very deeply embedded inside living creatures. And so there'll be things that call to us. Now, and attract our attention and pull us off our current path, which is exactly what happens to Moses. And this happens to him near Mount Sinai, which is the connection between the earthly and the divine.
The two dimensions, right?
And exactly, this vertical dimension. And so Moses pursues this thing that glimmers and gleams and compels him, and he pursues it right to the bottom. And as he gets closer and closer to the core concept, let's say, so that would be the core idea in this web of meaning, he starts to understand that he's on sacred ground. Right.
So Moses, as an exemplar of the human being, is experiencing a call from the holy, from the fire of God's manifestation before him. And just a little bit later, he takes this even deeper now, talking about the voice and the call. Again, it's part of this existentialist network of communication that we're embedded in, and that God is at the heart of, making an invite, a moral invite to us.
Okay, so Moses allows himself to be transformed and compelled in this interaction with what calls to him. Then the voice underlying being itself reveals itself to him, right? The essence of being, let's say, or it's more than that. Just as the truth is not instantiated in a given truth, as you pointed out. The principle of being is not okay. So that's what Moses gets in touch with. But then, so what's very cool there is that's also
just to stop that there, you can see Jordan Peterson is desperately trying to sort of link in with Jordan Peterson. He almost says it's more than the essence of being. Well, that was never the point of Thomism, actually. God's essence is his existence within that system. You can see Jordan Peterson is desperately trying, and then he sort of says, well, of course, as you said, particular truth is not universal truth. He's saying something like that. Well, did Peterson say that? He's hardly used the word truth, actually. He did when he was talking about transcendentals, but I think that's the only time. So Peterson's, trying very hard, but it's surely an impossible task to connect his system with Bishop Barron's system. And he sort of has to just stop mid-sentence just before the bit where I've stopped the video. And now he just gets back to his heart vision.
So now that he's grounded in the right place, or now that he's established a proper relationship with the transcendent and ineffable ideal, he now becomes the man who's capable of fighting against tyranny and destroying slavery. Exactly. And despite his inadequacies, right? Because he still can't speak. He's right. Yeah. So it doesn't matter. The message there is, regardless of the limitations that have been imposed upon you by fate and circumstance, if you delve deep enough, if you follow your calling with sufficient integrity, you'll form a relationship, a covenantal relationship with that which underlies being itself, and that will make you the leader capable of eternally opposing tyranny and leading people out of slavery.
Again, right at the end there, he's using some of Bishop Barron's concepts, but are they being used in the way that coheres with his own system? Is he using concepts in the way that cohere with Bishop Barron's system? Just to conclude, it's great they're discussing. It's great that they have great respect for each other. But have they really had this sort of frank discussion? I encourage them to have. If any of them happens to be listening to this, it's unlikely. But there's deeper issues that need to be worked out here and need to be resolved. Not least was Kant's, or to what extent was Kant's turn to the subject a metaphysical move? And if they do that, then they can explore some of Bishop Barron's excitement with the concept of similarity, which I think is important. Seems to me it's a very important concept for Western philosophy that hasn't really been dealt with enough. So I do think there's something exciting to be explored there. And similarly, what is freedom? Is Sartre right? And therefore, how do we indeed engage with modern culture constructively, as they both have done, of course, very well indeed, again, for which we thank them. Thank you very much.